Chapter 7. The process of reading. Assimilation of the paragraph. Coverage of the book. The main content of the book. Reading with elaboration. Reading books of the opposite content. Collective reading. Rereading. 1. Reading process. Having familiarized ourselves with the book and having received a general idea of it, we can start reading it. Here, the majority of readers will benefit from the principle that we have already talked about. From the general impression, go to the parts, to the details. It is very useful, starting to work out a chapter, first run through it, and familiarize yourself with the general content. Then you need to highlight the main topics of it and work through each one in turn. At the end of the chapter, try to give yourself a clear and accurate account of its content, in the main thoughts, in connection between them, in the plan of the chapter. The synopsis, which we will discuss in more detail later on, will provide great and necessary help in self-education. Here it is necessary to dwell on one point from what has just been said. We advise, after preliminary acquaintance with the chapter, to divide it into main parts according to the meaning and work through each one in turn. When reading, there are two cases. Sometimes this work has to be done entirely by ourselves. Sometimes the author has divided the chapter into paragraphs or given a list of its contents in the table of contents or before the text of the chapter. Quite often he even indicated the topic of each paragraph in front of its text or in the margins, so that here the main work has already been done by the author. Sometimes programs play the same role. In ordinary reading, this work of the author or these programs are of great help to those who know how to use them. They save time and labor. We read and work through paragraph by paragraph, topic by topic, as indicated by the author. It is a different matter if we read for self-education. Here every reason to head to work very long 10 LJ be fully used. And from this point of view, one should prefer books where the author provides the selection of topics from the chapter to the work of the reader. Thus, if the author gives a list of contents or we have some kind of program, we do not use all of this at first. We divide the chapter ourselves into parts, into paragraphs according to meaning, clearly highlighting the processing of the most important topics in one whole and writing out the exact names of these topics on a piece of paper. In a word, we ourselves draw up a list of the contents of the chapter upon preliminary acquaintance with it. And then we compare our list with the list of the author or program and consider what is the difference, why the author singled out a different topic than us, whether he is right, etc. The work is instructive and interesting. It teaches us to see the essential in the read, to distinguish the essential from the non-essential. Often even more important is this application of the so-called test questions found in some textbooks. We can advise you to read them not earlier than after working through the entire chapter, especially if we are working on the first book on this science. After reading these questions, sometimes we have to rework our elaboration. But we got an excellent lesson in this science and in the art of reading in general. 2. Assimilation of a paragraph. The first condition is to clearly understand it. To clearly understand means to be able to accurately and clearly define its topic and briefly state the answer to it. This self-examination is the best means of self-control when reading. If we do not know how to give ourselves an accurate and concise answer, it means that something is amiss. We have poorly understood. I have to try again. There are times when a paragraph, despite all efforts, cannot be understood. This is either the fault of the author, or a consequence of our lack of the necessary information. In such cases, it is best to mark the topic of the paragraph and page on a special sheet and read on. On further reading, you may come across passages that relate to the same topic or provide information necessary for understanding it. Then we go back to the incomprehensible paragraph with a new weapon and often overpower it. Proof. In many books we find evidence of certain thoughts. You need to be able to understand them, which is not always easy, and often very difficult. Each proof has three parts. 1. Thesis, the thought that is being proved. 2. The grounds that are given in support of the thesis. And 3. The connection between the grounds and the thesis is such a connection that, having accepted the grounds, we must accept the thesis. It necessarily follows from them. If the grounds are unacceptable to us, then the proof is not convincing either. If the grounds are true, but the thesis does not follow or does not follow from them, then the author's proof is all the more unconvincing. To understand the proof means to clearly find out what is being proved, what grounds are given and how the thesis follows from them. To criticize a proof means to prove the unacceptability of the grounds or their lack of connection with the thesis. The thesis does not follow from them and, therefore, is not proven. More detailed information about proofs can be obtained from logic textbooks. Pictures and drawings. Pictures and drawings are very important for understanding many books. The drawings are carefully considered by most of the readers. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the drawings. Here they are often content with the overall impression. For example, how many non-specialist readers have considered properly animal drawings in a zoology textbook? Have you delved into all the details of the image? Drawing is a surrogate for reality, considering it is a surrogate for observation. He who does not know how to observe well in reality does not know how to observe well in a drawing, and vice versa. He who learns to observe in the picture, to a greater or lesser extent improves his ability to observe in reality. While reading, one should not lose sight of this means of self-development. 3. Embracing the book. From the general impression, always more or less incomplete, often unclear, we have so far moved on to the perception of the parts, from the general impression of the book to reading the chapters, from the general impression of the chapters to the reading of the paragraphs. If the reader is limited to only this, he will do half the battle. Having started reading, he needs to go at the same time in the opposite way, from parts to the whole, to embrace the whole. Having clearly understood the paragraph, he should connect it with the other paragraphs of the chapter into one whole. After reading a chapter, he must link it with other chapters in a department, departments, in a whole book. Having finished the book, he must embrace it, get from it a general, complete and distinct in the main details impression. Seeing for the first time some kind of apparatus, some kind of mechanism, we get from it the first general impression. Then we decompose it into parts and study each part separately. Then again we put all the parts together and get a clear idea of the whole mechanism, its essence and work. The reader does the same when working through the book. And in this work, the most important and most essential help is provided by the synopsis. 4. The main content of the book. Let us briefly repeat what is necessary in order to fully master the book as a whole. To do this, you need to a. Try to in the shortest possible words, as accurately as possible in writing formulate the main idea or essence, its main content. Then it is very useful to look for an opportunity to convey its content to someone, whether in the form of an abstract or in the form of a simple conversation about the book. You will often ask someone, have you read such and such a book? I read it, of course. I couldn't read it. What is the essence of the book? What does the author say? The interlocutor is sometimes embarrassed. Indeed, what is the essence of the book? He didn't even think about it. He will say, often just now thinking, something incomprehensible, vague, sometimes completely insignificant, and sometimes such that if the author heard, the reader would not be well. Of course, this should not be the case for a good reader in general, and even more so for a reader for self-education. If he makes a mistake in this, he is a bad reader. b. After reading the book, it is very useful to restore in general terms in memory and the scheme of its contents according to the table of contents or from the abstracts. Try to cover all the content you read as a whole, once again clearly understand her plan. c. If there were passing notes by chapter or by department, it is extremely useful to process them into one complete summary of the entire book. In this case, you will often have to refer to the book and revise individual passages. And what seemed to be the most significant in the chapters and sections can sometimes fade into the background, and stand out what was not previously distinguished. g. If attached to the book subject indexes, then it is useful to take from it the most important questions for us and try to understand what the author has said on this topic. And then look at the places marked in the index and compare. This may reveal interesting details. Finally, and generally helpful, going through the index to see if you have highlighted any important topics while reading, etc. 5. Reading with elaboration. Reading like this is really difficult, especially at first, for a long time. But on the other hand, it also bears extremely valuable fruits. First of all, the book is not only amazingly memorable, it is worked out, it is assimilated in the full sense of the word. The content becomes ours, as we agreed with it, enters the flesh and blood of thinking. Thousands of connections inextricably linked it with our personality, became part of our personality, therefore, consciously or unconsciously, directly or indirectly, it cannot but affect our activities. What you rejected also brought little noticeable, maybe, but sometimes huge benefit. Your own thoughts have become more precise, found out, sometimes they have changed, cleared of weaknesses, strengthened. Often they receive unexpected, new, broad development, and so on. The gymnastics of thinking that we have to do in such work has the most beneficial effect on our strength. We grow mentally. The mind is disciplined, expanded, developed. This becomes noticeable pretty soon. There is no better mental gymnastics than this in book education. Whoever knows how to get involved and conscientiously fulfill it, then it, in the end, begins to deliver true pleasure, and at the same time the difficult becomes easy. 6. Reading books of opposite content. After reading one book in this way, it is very important and useful to read, if any, a book on the same topic, but in the opposite direction. In this case, you can read it, in general, without much elaboration. But those passages that are exactly opposite to the book read or contain criticism of its views should be read with full study. This elaboration, of course, is accompanied here by another important and often extremely interesting work, a constant comparison of the views of both authors, clarification of differences, an assessment of the comparative strength of arguments in favor of both, weighing objections, etc. Lack of necessary knowledge, and for similar reasons, we cannot understand which author is right. This should not be embarrassed. The very posing of the question and the reflection on it is already an acquisition and an important step towards knowledge. In addition, with conscientious work of this kind, we are cured of narrowness and partiality of views. We are freed from all kinds of blinders that obscure vision. This reading is especially important on issues of our specialty, on issues of worldview, etc. For many, it is extremely fruitful to read in parallel two books, especially different or even 15. Opposite in views. Then here we are dealing not so much with the study of books as with the study of the issue. Having read the presentation and solution of the problem, the explanation of the fact, etc. in one book, we read and compare the same section in another. At the same time, we often draw attention to points that we would not have singled out in the first book without it. The understanding of many issues is deepening. Our own views are expanding. What was not clear enough in one book is more clearly stated in another. Information omitted in one book is supplemented by another, etc., etc. 7. Collective reading. It is useful if it does not interfere with the initiative of the participants, mainly when each participant has previously worked the question or book himself, as indicated above. With a different setting, collective reading may not bring the proper benefit. One thing is certain: mutual communication awakens thought, competition, introduces new, often unexpected points of view, maintains interest in various issues of science, art and life. In this respect, the circle is irreplaceable. But where all this will lead, whether the circle turns into a real means of real self-education or into a laboratory of talkers, phrase-mongers, people with a mess in their heads, who have picked up various ideas, it depends on the formulation of the work. If the circle picks up a question and the participant their material as described above, and then there is a discussion, such works through work, of course, is highly desirable and extremely useful for the participants. I will say, it is of great importance. But it cannot replace a separate work, but only supplements and improves it. 8. Rereading the most important books. Rereading plays an important role in self-education. No matter how carefully and skillfully Thea worked the book while reading, 16 reader, while paying attention to certain aspects, to some thoughts, he did not notice others, also often important. On repeated reading, the first points will already be familiar. They will not require the power of attention to the same degree, and therefore we will see new things in the book and will sometimes be surprised, as we did not notice it before. Therefore, for a deep study of the book, it is absolutely not enough to read it once. It should be remembered that reading a book is pleasant, rereading is sometimes even more pleasant. Great works of art, the most important works in our specialty, should be our frequent interlocutors. Sometimes try to reread any book after a long interval, and you will discover a phenomenon surprising at first glance. A book that seemed surprisingly deep and beautiful on first reading often changes noticeably. Sometimes you wonder what you found good in her before. And vice versa, the book that we didn't like now becomes surprisingly interesting and deep. For the most part, this is a sign of growth and at the same time some measure of it. One should not only go to extremes and limit all reading to rereading 2 or 3 books. As good as they are, it is as if we decided to look at the world only through 2 or 3 holes in the wall.